Guilt is a powerful motivator, but it's not a good one. I still remember to this day visiting a church many years ago and listening to a sermon. I don't remember what the passage was on, but I remember the way that the pastor ended the sermon. He had us turn to Romans chapter 10, and he read verses 14 and 15. But how are they to call on him in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach unless they are sent? I don't remember anything else about the sermon, but I do remember that as the pastor ended his sermon, he looked out over the congregation and he practically pointed his fingers and he said to us, if you have an opportunity to tell someone about Jesus, but you chicken out and you don't say anything, that person might never hear and believe in Jesus. And like the watchman in Ezekiel chapter 33, he may die in his sins, but because you did not warn him, God is going to hold you accountable. Yikes. I was an ordained pastor when I heard this sermon, and it still got under my skin. Wow, God, do you really think of me that way? Are you really angry at me because I lack courage when it comes to evangelism? And maybe you're not exactly angry with me, but surely you're disappointed with me. Well, I spent much of my young adult life in Christian environments that were very passionate about motivating all of us as followers of Jesus to be active in sharing our faith in him. And that's a noble biblical thing, but they often used some form of guilt motivation to get their point across. It's up to you. If you fail, then other people might end up in hell. Would it surprise you to hear that I spent much of those years overwhelmed with feelings of guilt and failure? Eventually, I got to the point where I said, enough. I'm not going to let people guilt me into feeling like a failure anymore. But unfortunately, my pendulum kind of swung to the other extreme, and I stopped taking the initiative in sharing my faith with people at all. I just wanted to wait until they came and asked me. What it all comes down to is a very important question. Is evangelism something I do, or is it something God does? Am I responsible for spreading the gospel to all the nations, or is God responsible, regardless of what I do? Is God waiting for me to take the initiative to share the good news of Jesus with people so that he can step in and finish saving them? Or is God going to save whomever he wants, whenever he wants, whether he uses me or some other means? So to answer that question, first of all, I need to go back to the Romans 10 passage. Listen to how Paul wrapped up his statements in Romans 10, verse 15. He said, and how are they to preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news. Somehow, Paul had gotten to a place where his motivation was positive. He had a motivation that was not driven by guilt and fear. And so the question for you and I remains this: how should we as Christians understand our responsibility for sharing the gospel with others? Well, I have to start with the Great Commission, Matthew 28, verses 19 and 20. Go therefore and make disciples. Clearly, this is a command that Jesus expects us to follow. If we call ourselves Christians, disciples of his, then we are being disobedient to Jesus if we are not actively going out for the purpose of trying to make disciples. But at the same time, Jesus also said in John chapter 6, verse 37, all that the Father gives me will come to me, and whoever comes to me, I will never cast out. And then down in verse 44, no one can come to me unless the Father draws him, and I will raise him up on the last day. Very clearly, God is the one who draws people to Jesus. Jesus is the one who saves them. God is not waiting for us to be obedient so that he can do his part in saving people. But I want you to hear me very clearly on this first point. Not one person will go into eternal judgment because of your lack of courage. The Old Testament consistently said what Ezekiel 18 verse 20 says, "The soul who sins shall die. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon himself." God does not ever hold you responsible for the eternal destiny of another person. So, do I need to pursue people with the gospel, or can I just wait for people to come ask me about Jesus? Well, from the Great Commission, I clearly should not be passive. I need to be a pursuer with the gospel. We all do. But we need the same perspective that the Apostle Paul had in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Starting in verse 19, he wrote this, "For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became as a Jew, in order to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became as one under the law. To those outside the law, I became as one outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some." Paul used every ounce of strength and initiative and wisdom that he could muster to pursue people with the good news of Jesus. But why did he do it? What was his motivation? Verse 23, "I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessing." You see, God does not motivate by guilt and shame. God motivates by joy and blessing. And the key for me has been to realize that God does not guilt me into doing evangelism, but he does challenge me, and he invites me to share in the joy of the process. And that is a key distinction. God saves people. God doesn't need me in the process, but God delights to give you and me a share of the joy of being a part of that process. If you're not sharing your faith, God's not going to be angry with you. You're just missing out on the joy of watching the light of faith in Jesus flicker on for the first time in another person's eyes. Don't be motivated by fear of not doing enough. Be motivated by the joy of participating in God's saving work. As usual, God's word has all the wisdom you need for today's challenges.